A 6-year-old boy died when his home collapsed in a coastal town in Colombia. A woman in Indonesia watched the ocean pull back from the shore in the pre-dawn darkness and knew, without needing anyone to tell her, exactly what that meant. 300,000 people in southern Japan were told to leave their homes because a fault that scientists thought had already released its stress a decade ago had finally finished the job. A young girl was hospitalized in Spain after debris fell from a building she'd never expected to be dangerous. And in the California desert, seismometers buried in the ground began recording earthquake after earthquake in a stretch of land sitting almost exactly between two of the most closely watched fault systems in North America. 5 countries. 5 completely different stories, all of it happening within the same handful of weeks. This is the story of what actually happened in each of these places, told in the kind of detail these events deserve, and it's also the story of why the human mind is almost perfectly wired to see a pattern here that the physical evidence simply doesn't support. Subscribe to the channel before we go further, because this is exactly the kind of investigation I love running. The ones where following the evidence honestly means resisting the easiest, most dramatic conclusion. Let's start in Colombia, because this is where the human cost of this entire sequence has been the highest, and because the way this disaster actually unfolded hour by hour tells you something genuinely important about how earthquakes reveal themselves in stages rather than all at once. At 7:34 in the morning on August 10th, 2026, the ground beneath the department of Chaco in western Colombia tore open along the boundary where the Nazca Plate has been sliding beneath the South American Plate for millions of years. The rupture reached magnitude 7.4 to 7.5, centered near the small, remote community of San Jose del Palmar, and within minutes, buildings across Cali, Pereira, and Quibdó began coming down. The first reports arriving within hours spoke of just over 100 dead. By the next morning, that figure had climbed to 132, then to 200. Then, as rescue crews finally worked their way into the hardest hit and hardest to reach communities in the following days, it climbed past 319, with more than 4,600 injured and over 260 people still listed as missing. I want you to sit with that specific pattern, the way this death toll climbed in stages rather than arriving as one final number, because it captures something genuinely important about the geography of this disaster. Rescue crews initially couldn't even reach the epicenter itself, the region simply too underdeveloped, too difficult to access for help to arrive at the speed the disaster demanded. Colombia's own aviation authority suspended flights to Quibdó, Armenia, Cartago, Buenaventura, Cali, and Rio Negro, cutting off some of the fastest routes into the affected zone, right when speed mattered most. In Cali, a section of a hospital collapsed, forcing staff to evacuate pediatric and neonatal patients into a temporary facility set up inside a school gymnasium, doctors moving incubators and monitoring equipment into a space with none of the infrastructure a functioning neonatal ward requires, doing what they could with what little they had. In Pereira, rescue crews worked at a collapsed 7-story building near Plaza Bolivar for days, using a crane to lift massive sections of concrete secured with chains before anyone could safely search beneath them, while a man was photographed being consoled after finding his pet amid the debris of a collapsed building in the Mejia Robledo neighborhood. One small, specific moment of grief and relief captured amid a citywide catastrophe. And in the coastal town of Bahia Solano, a 6-year-old boy named Mateo Valencia died when his home came down around him, the son of the town's own mayor. A tragedy specific and personal enough that it briefly became the human face of a disaster that, statistically, had already claimed hundreds of lives. The mayor's office released a statement describing how deeply Mateo's passing had saddened the institution and the entire municipality, a formal, official statement carrying the unmistakable weight of a parent grieving in public, while still responsible for leading his community through the worst disaster in its living memory. Colombia's new president, Abelardo de la Espriella, only recently in office, found himself facing exactly the kind of crisis that defines a presidency, traveling to Manizales to survey the damage in person, while the death toll behind him continued climbing with each passing hour. This wasn't a freak accident of geology. Western Colombia sits along one of the most seismically productive stretches of coastline on the entire planet, the same broader subduction system, responsible for some of the largest earthquakes ever instrumentally recorded, occurring along the neighboring coast of Ecuador earlier in the last century. The ground here has always carried this capacity. It simply hadn't released it in this specific location for long enough that most of the people living directly above it had never experienced anything like what happened that August morning. Now follow the story east, across the Pacific to Indonesia, where something genuinely strange happened within the same 24-hour period. A coincidence of timing that tells 2 completely different stories depending on which specific earthquake you're following. At 5:58 in the morning on August 15th, a magnitude 7.7 earthquake ruptured near Flores Island, and in the coastal regency closest to the epicenter, residents watched. Something that every coastal community in this part of the world has learned, generation after generation, to fear more than the shaking itself. The sea pulled back from the shore, exposing the ocean floor in the pre-dawn darkness, the single most universally recognized warning sign in all of natural disaster science. They didn't wait for an official alert. They ran for higher ground, and that instinct, inherited from a region with its own long, painful history of tsunami disaster, the devastating 1992 Flores tsunami that killed roughly 2,500 people in almost this exact same location, almost certainly saved lives before the wave itself, reaching heights of 1.6 meters, actually arrived. By the time rescue teams could reach the hardest hit areas, many of them cut off entirely by landslides across 6 separate regencies that blocked the island's only major highway. The confirmed death toll had climbed to at least 73 people, with disaster officials warning directly that the true number was likely to keep rising as crews finally reached villages that had been completely isolated since the moment the ground first shook. Here's where the story becomes genuinely stranger, because just hours later, that same day, a second earthquake struck, magnitude 6.9, more than 1,000 miles away, near a place with one of the most consequential names in all of Earth's volcanic history, Toba. This is the site of the largest volcanic eruption of the last 2.5 million years. An event so massive, some researchers believe it may have come close to threatening humanity's own survival roughly 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano whose caldera today forms one of the largest lakes on the entire planet. An earthquake this significant striking so close to a supervolcano this powerful should, by every intuitive instinct, be terrifying. And yet, geologists confirmed within hours that this specific earthquake had almost nothing to do with the volcano. Sitting beside it, it occurred 172 kilometers beneath the surface, deep within the subducting slab of the Indo-Australian plate itself, an entirely mechanical process of a tectonic plate bending and fracturing as it descends into the mantle, felt by more than 11 million people, and yet causing not a single reported injury or casualty, precisely because that immense depth stripped away almost all the shaking's destructive power before it ever reached the surface. 2 earthquakes, similar in raw magnitude, born from the same broader tectonic system, and yet one killed dozens of people, while the other, felt by millions, killed no one at all, a genuinely stark demonstration of how much depth alone can determine an earthquake's ultimate human cost. Let's follow the thread further north to Japan, where the story actually began several weeks earlier and never fully stopped, and where the scientific detective work behind this specific earthquake genuinely deserves to be told in full. On July 28th, a magnitude 6.8 earthquake tore through the Kumamoto region of southern Japan, and 300,000 people were told to evacuate as a tsunami advisory went out for the Ariake and Yatsushiro seas within minutes of the shaking. A shopping mall collapsed. 13 people died, according to Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi's confirmation the following morning, with many more injured or still missing as rescue crews worked through the overnight hours. But the genuinely fascinating detail buried inside this disaster, the one that turns it into a real scientific mystery worth investigating, is exactly which fault ruptured and why. Researchers confirmed it was the Hinagu fault zone, the same fault system responsible for Japan's devastating 2016 Kumamoto earthquakes, a sequence still studied intensively across Japanese seismology a full decade later. And in the days and weeks that followed the 2026 rupture, Japanese scientists studying satellite imagery and ground displacement data reached a genuinely striking conclusion. This specific segment of the fault appeared to represent unreleased strain, what Japanese researchers term Warinokori, a leftover portion of the 2016 rupture sequence that had never fully finished playing out, essentially a section of fault that had been sitting there for 10 years, quietly holding on to strain that its neighboring segments had already released. A fault, in other words, that had been waiting to finish something it started in 2016, before, finally, in the summer of 2026, completing the job. Researchers from Hiroshima University traveled to the region specifically to conduct on-site field investigations, documenting surface fault traces and elevation changes measurable across a roughly 10-kilometer radius, physical evidence of the ground itself stepping and shifting across roads and elevated highways, visible proof that this decade-old, unfinished business had finally, violently resolved itself. Experts have since warned that the stress redistributed by this rupture may have added strain to surrounding active faults, meaning the story of this specific fault segment may not yet be entirely finished either. A genuinely unsettling thought, given how directly this event connects backward to 2016 and potentially forward to whatever comes next. Now travel across the world to Spain, to a region most people would never think to associate with major earthquake danger at all, and to a story that began not with a single dramatic rupture, but with a quiet, escalating sequence over the course of a single week. On August 15th, at 1:04 in the morning, a magnitude 4.8 to 5.2 earthquake struck near the town of Alhendin in Granada province, arriving just hours after a smaller magnitude. 3.7 foreshock had already rattled the same area that Friday evening, the ground giving a warning most residents had no way to properly interpret in the moment. Just 3 days later, on the morning of August 18th, a second quake, magnitude 4.8 to 4.9, struck nearby Gojar, this time in broad daylight in the middle of the region's peak summer tourist season. This time, the danger reached one of Spain's most treasured historic sites. The Alhambra, a UNESCO World Heritage Monument visited by millions of people every year, had to evacuate its Nasrid palaces and Alcazaba as a precaution while specialists rushed to inspect centuries-old plasterwork and masonry for damage, staff working carefully through galleries and courtyards that had survived centuries of history, now being checked room by room for cracks that hadn't existed the day before. A young girl was hospitalized after falling debris injured her elsewhere in the city, one of 3 people confirmed to have suffered minor injuries, as more than 50 separate calls came into emergency services, reporting cracked walls and falling roofing material across the Granada metropolitan area. Seismologists studying the sequence found something genuinely eerie buried in the historical record. The same 2 towns, Alhendin and Gojar, had already appeared together in Granada's seismic history once before, during a swarm that struck this exact region in 1979, centered on the nearby town of Fuente Vaqueros 47 years earlier. The same ground, waking up again in almost exactly the same place after nearly half a century of quiet, and Granada seismologist Jose Morales has drawn that specific historical parallel directly, while being honest that it remains genuinely too early to know whether this current sequence will ultimately resemble that older one in scale or duration. And finally, back across the Atlantic, to a stretch of California desert most Americans have never heard of, where the story unfolds not through a single dramatic event, but through the strange, unpredictable rhythm of an earthquake swarm. The Brawley seismic zone sits in the Imperial Valley, in the precise structural gap connecting the southern end of the San Andreas Fault to the northern end of the Imperial Fault, a location scientists have specifically found to sit atop hidden cross faults linking these 2 major systems together beneath the surface. In May 2026, this zone erupted into activity beginning in the earliest hours of a Saturday morning. Foreshocks building through the day until, by that evening, the sequence had escalated into more than 350 individual earthquakes, the strongest reaching magnitude 4.7, felt as far away as Pacific Palisades and Los Alamitos. In August, it started again, opening with at least 19 recorded events and continuing for multiple consecutive days, a second chapter in a story this exact patch of desert has now told twice within a single year. Underlying all of it sits a genuinely sobering historical fact. The southernmost section of the San Andreas Fault, capable of producing an earthquake of magnitude 7 or larger, hasn't ruptured since sometime between 1680 and 1690, well over 300 years of accumulated stress with no major release, considerably longer than the fault's own documented average recurrence pattern would predict. And in a separate but genuinely connected piece of research, scientists studying the broader southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems, using 1,000 years of physics-based stress modeling, identified a location called Cajon Pass, an earthquake gate where a rupture on one fault could potentially jump onto the other, finding that current stress levels across this entire system sit at or above the highest values recorded anywhere across that full millennium of simulated history. So here we are, 5 countries, 5 genuinely different stories, all converging within the same narrow window of time. And I think the honest, most intellectually responsible thing I can do with this investigation is tell you directly what the evidence actually supports and what it doesn't. These 5 events are not connected to each other in any established physical sense. Colombia's earthquake occurred along the Nazca South American plate boundary. Indonesia's 2 earthquakes occurred along entirely separate structures within the Indo-Australian and Eurasian plate system, one shallow and near the surface, one deep within a subducting slab. Japan's earthquake occurred on a specific, previously identified fault segment thousands of miles from any of the others. Spain's swarm occurred along the slow, grinding boundary between the African and Eurasian plates and the Mediterranean. And California's activity occurred along the San Andreas system, on the opposite side of an entire ocean from every other event on this list. There is no scientifically established mechanism, no known physical pathway, by which stress released in one of these locations could travel far enough, fast enough, to trigger or meaningfully influence an earthquake in any of the others. What connects these 5 stories isn't geology. It's something closer to statistics and to human psychology. The USGS estimates the Earth produces roughly 50,000 detectable earthquakes every single year, an enormous, continuous background hum of tectonic activity happening constantly across the planet's network of plate boundaries. On any given week, multiple earthquakes above magnitude 5 and periodically well above that are essentially guaranteed to occur somewhere on Earth. Most of the time, they happen in places far enough from population centers or far enough beneath the surface that they never reach your attention at all. What happened across these 5 weeks wasn't a surge in the planet's underlying seismic activity. It was a cluster of individually significant, individually newsworthy events, each one large enough or close enough to a population center to generate real coverage, happening to land within the same narrow stretch of the calendar and the human mind, wired since our earliest ancestors to detect patterns as a survival mechanism. Almost can't help but connect 5 simultaneous headlines into a single unified story, even when the physical evidence underneath them tells 5 completely separate tales. I think that's genuinely the most important thing this entire investigation reveals. Not a hidden, connected mechanism linking 5 distant earthquakes together, but a genuine, honest demonstration of how differently the same basic phenomenon, plates grinding, slipping, and rupturing against each other, can play out depending on exactly where, exactly how deep, and exactly which specific fault happens to give way. A shallow rupture in an underdeveloped stretch of Colombian coastline killed hundreds. A deep rupture beneath Sumatra, felt by millions, killed no one. A fault in Japan finished a job it started a decade earlier. A quiet corner of southern Spain woke up for the first time in almost 50 years. And a stretch of California desert kept doing exactly what it's done before, in 1981, in 2005, in 2012, and now twice in the same year, sitting directly atop one of the most consequential, most historically overdue fault junctions on the entire continent. If you have any personal connection to any of these 5 places, Colombia, Indonesia, Japan, Spain, or the affected parts of California, I'd genuinely love to hear from you, because behind every one of these statistics sits real people, living through something the rest of us only encounter as a headline scrolling past on a screen. And if you don't have any direct connection to any of them, I think this story is still worth sitting with because it's a genuine reminder that this planet is constantly, quietly moving beneath every single one of us, whether or not it happens to make the news in any given week. I'll be following all 5 of these stories as they continue to develop, watching Colombia's ongoing search and rescue efforts as families continue waiting for word. On the hundreds still listed as missing, Japan's and Spain's continuing aftershock sequences, and whether California's Brawley swarm activity reactivates again, as it has twice already this year. Subscribe so you don't miss that follow-up, and drop a comment below with your own connection to any of these 5 places, or your own honest reaction to how differently these 5 stories actually turned out despite all starting from the same basic physics. Stay curious about the quiet, constant motion happening beneath the ground you stand on, because sometimes the most important lesson a moment like this one can teach us isn't that something unusual is happening. It's that the ordinary, everyday behavior of this planet is more active and more varied than most of us ever stop to notice. I will see you in the next one.